The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar with Pivot. Before we begin, we originally had Wendy Nahaney come do a territorial welcome, but Wendy may not be able to make it tonight to open this event with her territorial welcome. And if she's able to make it a bit later, we will invite her to share a few words. But in the meantime, I'd like to share a territorial acknowledgement that we use at Pivot. We recognize that Pivot's work takes place on the stolen lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful for Indigenous peoples' continuous relationship to this land, and we are committed to learning to work in solidarity as accomplices in shifting the colonial default. And just a few sort of housekeeping items. My name is Kristen Chung. I am the development manager at Pivot, and I'll mostly be kind of doing the administrative side of things. And I just wanted to mention that all the speakers who are not talking will be muted. And when speakers are talking, their webcams and mics will be on screen. And we also have Kirsten Hagemoen, registered sign language interpreter, who will be providing sign language tonight, as you can see, and will be staying on screen throughout the whole evening. And our host for this webinar is Naomi Moses. Hi. Naomi is a lawyer at JFK Law in Vancouver. Naomi is privileged and humbled to practice Aboriginal law on behalf of Indigenous people and to work towards Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization. Naomi has also practiced class action litigation, criminal law, and constitutional law, and works to meet the legal needs of the LGBTQ+ people. Naomi has worked with Pivot since 2014 as a summer law student, a volunteer, a pro bono counsel, and they are deeply honored to serve as vice chair of Pivot's board of directors. And as mentioned earlier, I will be behind the scenes and I will turn off my webcam now, so the people speaking will be on webcam, so it's less distracting for all the viewers watching.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This webinar is called States of Inequality, Pivot's Response to COVID-19. Tonight, we'll discuss COVID-19's impacts on Pivot's campaign areas, homeless people's rights, drug policy, sex workers' rights, and criminalization and police accountability. We'll talk about how COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities and also allowed for some gains in our areas of work. And then we'll discuss some of the necessary next steps in our fight for justice. Our first speaker tonight is Meenakshi Mano, who is our criminalization and policing campaigner. In her role at Pivot, Meenakshi works alongside her interdisciplinary colleagues to envision intersectional approaches to policing and criminalization. She is also a grassroots organizer and works to further prison abolition as a member of the Vancouver Prison Justice Day Committee. As a campaigner at Pivot, she values the organization's uncompromising commitment to the expertise and vision of people with lived and living experience. Her work emphasizes the impact of policing on all aspects of Pivot's work, and her lens is also shaped by her training as a social worker. Thanks for joining us, Meenakshi.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you to Kirsten for interpreting tonight. I also want to thank everyone who's joined this webinar and people who have been following Pivot's work, some for many years and others more recently. I want to express that your support is appreciated. So I think looking back at the onset of the COVID-19 public health emergency, very few of us had a sense of how it would shape Pivot's campaign areas. I don't think that I could have foreseen the movement to defund the police that is currently underfoot. And I do believe that we're in an incredible moment to radically alter our relationships to justice and law enforcement. I want to credit Black abolitionist thinkers and Indigenous knowledge keepers who for over 100 years in this country alone have maintained that another world is possible. I also want to open by affirming that Black Lives Matter, that Indigenous sovereignty is non-negotiable, and we must push ourselves and our communities to collectively imagine a world without police and prisons as the pathway out of inlaid violence. So to speak to COVID-19 specifically, as I mentioned, few of us knew what was going to happen. But at the outset, a number of Pivot staff started to raise concerns about conditions in the downtown east side specifically, but essentially conditions that were permeating all low-income communities throughout BC and frankly throughout the world. What we saw in the downtown east side was the organized abandonment that took place in the early days of COVID-19 as both services and shops shuttered. We saw the very real potential for an outbreak of COVID. And beyond that, we saw the potential for existing issues of inequality to become exacerbated, including issues with police accountability. So to that end, in early April, Caitlin Shane, staff lawyer, and myself wrote to the Vancouver Police Board, identifying areas to, quote, deprioritize in terms of policing. These were areas that disproportionately impacted Indigenous, racialized, and poor people, including people who use drugs and people who participate in informal economies like vending, dealing, or sex work. I'll be honest, we received a very tepid response from the Office of the Chief Constable. Despite that, we continue to push for a clawback of police powers. And now we're doing this work in coalition with organizations such as Hogan's Alley Society, Black Lives Matter Vancouver, the BC Civil Liberties Association, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. People tuning in may have seen the letter that was released yesterday calling for an end to street stops, authored by those aforementioned organizations. So in this current moment, the conversation about policing has been pushed to the forefront. And let's be clear, that's due to the tragic deaths of BIPOC folks at the hands of police, including Isha Hudson, Everett Patrick, Regis Krichinsky-Paquette, Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, and Ijaz Chowdhury. Their deaths were preventable. In the months since a groundswell of uprisings began, Pivot has been very vocal about our calls to action for police, including the VPD, as well as municipal police and the RCMP across BC. In addition to work being done in coalitions, we've also written to the province to demand action around policing, furthering the goals of defunding the police. I want to thank everyone who has supported the Police Accountability Campaign, because in a moment of global crisis, as a campaigner, I was able to draw on 20 years of work that was done by Pivot in order to refine calls to action and hopefully influence policy change. Our calls haven't always been perfect, and I don't want to supplant the work of directly impacted people or grassroots organizers, but I think that it's been really powerful to look back on 2 decades of work with directly impacted communities and really tangibly name police violence. Since the onset of COVID, I've also had the opportunity to author and co-author op-eds about the impact of policing and criminalization, to present our work at Pivot in webinars for both local and national audiences, and to also speak to the media about what defunding the police could mean. As an organization, we've been able to nimbly respond to this grassroots work because of relationships that have been built and tended to over nearly 2 decades of work. We could not have done this without your support. And again, I want to thank everyone for their time this evening, and I look forward to answering your questions and any info that you'd like to have about our policing and criminalization campaign. Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm back. Just figuring out how to unmute myself here. I wanted to let everyone know that at any time they can feel free to submit questions through the GoToWebinar control panel, which you should see in the top right hand of your screen. And if we have some time at the end, we'll try to do a little bit of a Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions. The next panelist I would like to introduce is Pivot Summer Legal Intern, Vyas Saran. Vyas is a South Asian settler and an Indo-Fijian Girmit descendant who is committed to intersectional and decolonial justice. Vyas hopes to contribute to pivot his background in activism, communications, policy research, and political strategy. In the fall, he will return to complete his final year of law school at the University of Victoria, which is located on Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ lands. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of British Columbia. Thanks very much for joining us, Vyas.
Hi, thanks Naomi, thanks everybody for tuning in. I just want to echo Meenakshi's thanks and credit towards Black abolitionist thinkers and Indigenous knowledge keepers who make our work possible. Because police abolition has existed as long as policing has, and these calls to action have never stopped. Most of us have just been extremely late to listening and amplifying these words. I just want to use this brief moment to introduce a series of articles coming out this summer on abolition. Together, we hope to fill a gap in the availability of resources that explains how policing actually works in so-called British Columbia, how policing is funded, and what exactly the avenues as well as the boundaries are for abolition in this province. Ourselves at Pivot and police abolition activists across Vancouver don't have all the answers to questions like who exactly polices where in BC, how much money is spent on militarization in individual policing budgets, and whether provincial or even federal governments can immediately intervene on in a local effort to defund the police, which is something that we have actually seen happen very recently in Victoria. Our hope here is to complete 3 research-based pieces with the context of Vancouver, Victoria, and provincial RCMP jurisdictions as the context. The first article, we explain how the context of policing in British Columbia we explain the context, ideally providing interactive elements that help us understand the mapping of policing. Second, we're going to explore the intricacies of police budgeting all the way down to line items, and we're also going to recommend what to defund first, because simply reducing funding is not enough when police forces could easily defund their community-focused endeavors and then focus themselves towards being a more hardened military organization. Hopefully through an article like that, we can lay out safeguards and ensure that we don't run into roadblocks. And third, in a third piece, we will look into the legal avenues and boundaries for defunding, which is a piece that I assume we will be discussing the need for community-led direct action over legal action, because our legal framework, honestly, was not designed for a world with policing, but for a world without policing. I hope to hear any recommendations, feedback, and advice for what that kind of series could look like. The end goal is that we have a resource that we can use to help inform abolition in the long run across BC, across Canada, and focus our efforts on what works. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Vyas. Our next speaker is Carrie Porth, who is our sex work policy consultant. Carrie first joined Pivot as a board member in 2011 and became chair of the board of directors, where she served from 2012 to 2017. A former sex worker and IV drug user, Carrie has personal experience of marginalization and social exclusion. She has provided expert advice to Pivot's sex work law reform campaign, responded to media requests, and testified to the Justice and Senate committees on behalf of Pivot during deliberations on the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. Carrie is currently contracted as a sex work policy consultant and also works as a community developer with Living in Community, an innovative project that seeks to balance perspectives on Vancouver's sex industry. Thanks so much for joining us, Carrie.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight and for your ongoing support of Pivot's work. Sex workers really experienced a sudden and complete drop-off of their income at the onset of COVID-19 restrictions. Many stopped working to protect their own health, but others found that there was a drastic reduction in demand for their services. This created a real sort of desperation as they tried to figure out how to pay their bills, how to look after their families, keep a roof over their heads, and to feed themselves. And to make things more difficult, we've had reports of over surveillance and harassment by police of sex workers working on our streets. Most sex workers were not able to access the Canada Emergency Response Benefit as their work is criminalized. While some sex workers do pay taxes, many others do not, mostly because their work is criminalized. Some sex workers don't know how to do their taxes, or others are afraid to do so because of criminalization. There was, or there is, an increase of $300 per month to income assistance checks for people who are on income assistance. And that has recently been extended through July and August, which is good news. But as we all know, income assistance rates are incredibly low, and an extra $300 didn't go very far to replace the income that sex workers gained from doing sex work. I attended a meeting in June with MP Hetty Fry, and it was attended by sex work organizations as well as sex workers to sort of talk to her about pressuring the federal government to remember that sex workers have been really left out of income replacement during COVID. And so far, no funding from the government has resulted from that meeting. So as usual, sex workers have only had each other to rely on and for help. And two Vancouver sex work organizations, Swan Vancouver and Pace Society, set up relief funds to try to help sex workers financially. Both organizations worked incredibly hard to fundraise for the relief funds, and they were quite successful. But in the end, they were only able to offer very small grants of $100 to $200 to help sex workers out. And we know that in an incredibly expensive city like Vancouver, $100 or $200 doesn't go very far. The Wish Drop-In Center worked really, really hard to make sure that their services were still available during the COVID crisis. So they managed to keep their drop-in open with having to have much reduced numbers of people inside and to achieve social distancing. They were also able, and they have a large back lot, to create a large covered area where it was also heated during the cooler months, and it feels like it's a cooler month these days, to provide services to sex workers there. They had meal delivery programs, the MAP van, which is the Mobile Access Project, which is a van that goes out 7 nights a week and visits all the known strolls in Vancouver to meet sex workers where they're at, has continued to operate. They were able to provide food to sex workers as well. Wish also initiated a brand new service of peer witnessing. So in the back lot, they have basically supervised drug consumption, mobilizing their peers to do that. During this time, some housing providers changed their guest policies to prevent people from having guests at all in their own homes due to COVID. And this really interfered with sex workers' ability to work from home, which is much safer than working on the streets. So as a result, some sex workers were forced to work on the streets in more dangerous circumstances. Some temporary housing was offered, as we all know, but many of those temporary housing options are now closing and people are being evicted back to the streets. They were promised aftercare plans after the temporary shelters and housing closed, but those don't seem to be happening. So one of the things we did at Pivot was to release a resource guide to help sex workers during COVID that linked to information from sex work support organizations, as well as health information from the BC Centre for Disease Control. And this also pointed them to the sex work relief funds should they need them. We worked to highlight the efforts of PACE and SWAN to help them with their fundraising activities and to distribute relief funds. During this time, I've also spoken to media to try to raise awareness about the plight of sex workers as their income dried up. Now that we're transitioning from phase 2 into phase 3, I'm pleased to see that there are no public health restrictions on sex work, and we're starting to see sex workers return to work, but many are finding that business is still very slow, so they're still in the situations of financial desperation. And finally, just thinking about the laws that continue to have a negative impact on sex workers, built into the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act is a requirement that the government review the laws after 5 years. We reached that milestone in December of last year, and yet the review hasn't started yet. We're assuming because the government has been consumed with dealing with the COVID crisis. Nevertheless, we've written to the Minister of Justice to keep the pressure up on them to ensure that this review happen very soon, and we're hoping that it will and that it will involve sex workers directly. So I've been working to prepare materials to help the government do a review of the laws when that happens. And I think overall, COVID has really brought the impact of criminalization on sex workers into stark relief, and Pivot will continue to work towards decriminalization of sex work in Canada. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Our next panelist is Caitlin Shane, who is the staff lawyer at Pivot working in the area of drug policy. Caitlin began working in the downtown east side a decade ago as an outreach and mental health worker. Before attending law school in 2013, she provided frontline services in support of housing, emergency shelters, community kitchens, and tent cities in Vancouver and Victoria. Caitlin began working at Pivot in 2015 and is currently focused on drug policy as a staff lawyer. Thanks for joining us, Caitlin.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks, Kristen, for interpreting. I want to start off by saying thanks so much to everyone who took time out of their schedules to hear about Pivot's work. One thing that has definitely remained constant in all the uncertainty is your support and confidence, so we really appreciate that. My area of focus at Pivot is drug policy, and it's been really interesting and kind of devastating to see the way that the COVID-19 emergency has been responded to by government, because even while that response has been imperfect and not always consistent, it was immediate, and it was something, and it was aggressive. And in the drug policy context, we've been in an existing state of emergency since 2016. So it's been 4 years of relative government inaction, of having doors being closed in our faces, of feeling the frustration and being told that things aren't possible. And now all of a sudden, we are seeing that things maybe were possible. And it's been a very disheartening sort of realization of whose lives matter and whose don't in this system. And so I don't want to be too gloomy, but yeah, it's been challenging, I think, for our communities to see. But on the other hand, it's also been really exciting to see things becoming possible. And I really do believe that we have the world to win, and we're in a place where radical changes to our structures are possible now in a way that they never were before. And so that's really exciting, and especially to be working at a place like Pivot where it feels like we have an opportunity now to make change. So that's good. almost immediately after the COVID emergency was declared, I started seeing the impacts on the drug policy campaign. So I was immediately hearing reports that the drug supply chain was breaking down. Border closures and directives to quarantine meant that people's access to their regular drug sources, their regular drug supplies, were no longer a sure thing. And we saw almost immediately after the declaration of the COVID-related emergency that the rate of fatal overdoses in Vancouver spiked. And we also saw the pandemic kind of forcing the closure of various basic health services, overdose prevention site services, community supports. So in short, COVID really introduced a new level of precarity into the lives of people who use drugs and left folks with even more minimal access to the most basic health services. So what are we doing? Almost immediately, we formed a loose coalition with the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition and the HIV/AIDS Legal Network out in Ontario with a renewed call to decriminalize simple drug possession. We got to work and asked the federal ministers of health and justice to grant an exemption, either national or provincial or municipal in scope, that would halt the enforcement of federal drug laws in relation to simple drug possession, which we know is a huge driver of drug use being pushed underground, directly undercuts the health and safety of people who use drugs, and has been incredibly ineffective in terms of lowering the rates of drug use. So to date, I'm happy to report that the call has received over 160 organizational sign-ons, including Amnesty International and the Canadian Nurses Association. And we've also had opportunity to meet with a range of government actors about next steps for decriminalization at the local and provincial level. So this would be something called de facto decriminalization in the absence of actual changes to the federal law. And we're currently building community and government support for a decriminalization pilot project. Amid these lobbying efforts to enact new laws and policies, we're also working to challenge incoming laws that hurt and harm people who use drugs. Last week, you may have heard that the BC government introduced Bill 22, which would amend our Mental Health Act and actually make it possible to make it mandatory to detain youth in the event that they have received care for an overdose and are deemed to have a particular addiction. We have serious fears that a bill like this is going to have a chilling effect on calls to 911. People already are reluctant to call 911 when there's an overdose, and now there's even more reason for youth not to call. And we're also concerned about a potential spike in withdrawal or fatal overdoses, given that short-term bouts of detention, like the ones authorized by this act, have a track record of leading to those fatal spikes. So to that end, we have submitted our concerns to the provincial ministers of health and mental health and addictions, and we're calling for the bill to be stopped before it passes into law. So do stay tuned on our social media, because we'll be posting updates about that bill. And then just in closing, I'll mention that we continue to provide support to folks at the grassroots level who have always and continue to take matters into their own hands in the absence of compassionate drug policy. We had the honor of attending an Action for Safe Supply 2 weeks ago, led by the Drug User Liberation Front. And it was there that folks were able to receive small quantities of drugs that had been screened for fentanyl. So for me, it was an action that really demonstrated the need for flexible, low barrier, safe supply options. And was also an important reminder that all of our drug policy has to be led by people who use drugs. I'm inspired by the community constantly, and I hope you are too. Thank you so much for tuning in for this update.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. Our next panelist is Anna Cooper, who is the staff lawyer at Pivot, working in the area of homelessness. Anna currently works as a staff lawyer at Pivot, where she focuses on the Homeless People's Rights campaign. Much of her work has focused on the rights and needs of people living in tent cities. As a white settler lawyer, Anna is committed to using the law as a tool to protect and advance the dignity of all people, while also recognizing that real justice cannot be achieved within the colonial legal system. Thanks for joining us, Anna.
Thank you for the introduction, Naomi. And I'm sorry to everyone that my webcam is not working. So I am the states of inequality slide for the next few minutes. I just want to start by echoing what all of my colleagues have already said, that COVID-19 just kind of exacerbated and highlighted existing inequalities in society. I think in particular in the downtown east side, we could quickly see that the policies that were built as a response to COVID-19 were predicated on the needs of the middle and upper class, and actually directly caused harm to low income and racialized communities. So for example, in the downtown east side, they rapidly closed many community spaces. But when people don't have their own living rooms or kitchens or places to be, the end result of that was actually that people within about a week had no access to public Wi-Fi. People weren't able to access any information. It basically led to an information desert. It also meant that people were crowded in the few remaining spaces that remained open. So the general failure of our government and local state actors to listen to people on the ground meant that policies were imposed in the name of public health that actively hurt people. And reiterating what some of my colleagues have already spoken to, guest-wide guest bans were imposed in many buildings in the name of protecting people from COVID-19, with the result that many people's friends and family who were actually living with them were evicted because they technically weren't tenants. Sex workers could not engage in work safety. We've seen a huge spike in overdoses, which is definitely tied to the fact that people are unable to engage in peer witnessing. And it didn't actually decrease the risk of exposure, because people who can't be with their friends and family and can't contact them via Wi-Fi are going to go out and find them to ensure that they're okay. So it caused a lot of harm and didn't help. A number of things that we've worked on in response to COVID-19. To begin with, on my campaign, we started hosting weekly calls for peers and advocates on the downtown east side. As just mentioned, the sheer lack of connectivity and Wi-Fi meant that people couldn't use the platforms that other people were using to stay connected and to organize. So a kind of rough and ready weekly call that we set up and initially allowed some people to come and attend those calls in person became an ongoing space for people on the ground to share information and kind of coordinate efforts, responding to needs on the ground. This has been with a number of partner organizations and peers, including folks from SRO Collaborative, PACE, WISH, Powell Street Festival, the Pacific Association of First Nations Women. Over time, we've had people from government asking to join those calls, to listen, and for it to inform their policy and work. And it's definitely informed our work, because it's meant that we have a steady flow of information from the ground about what is happening and what people's priorities are. It has also made exceptionally clear, again, just how much of community care is performed by unpaid and grassroots people who are picking up the slack that our government isn't fulfilling. In terms of housing policy during COVID-19, we joined a number of other organizations in pushing for the province to use their emergency powers to procure housing in order for homeless people to self-isolate. The government ultimately rejected this push, though they did acquire a number of emergency hotels. We also, from the start, have pushed for non-displacement of homeless people sheltering in place, writing letters to members of the City of Vancouver, the Parks Board, and provincial government. There's clear evidence that displacement always causes harm to people who are forced to live outside, but that harm is clearly exacerbated in a time where we are asking people to social distance and self-isolate. being constantly forced to move puts both their personal and other people's health at risk. Despite the fact that there are a number of public health actors, and ultimately even Bonnie Henry, our provincial health officer, acknowledging that constant displacement can make things worse, we experienced really intense intransigence around this policy of daily displacement, which I think just goes to show how the refusal to engage with people around their needs to occupy space while being unhoused is grounded in stigma and in a desire to not see the visible signs of the failure of government policy rather than actual public health goals. Because at this point, the clear calls from public health align with what we have been saying all along, which is that constant displacement is a risk. We have had some success. We engaged in a joint effort with the BC Civil Liberties Association and the UBCIC, writing letters to Victoria City Council, who decided to temporarily halt their bylaws of displacing people and are considering shifting that policy long term. There's a hope that if we can get even one city council across BC to change those bylaws and bring them more in line with the needs of people who are currently unsheltered, that can become a wedge to influence other municipalities. We've also continued to advocate for people who are tent cities more broadly, not just individuals sheltering in space alone. Unfortunately, after a year of working alongside Parks Board members and members of BC Housing around Oppenheimer Park and having some success in getting the Parks Board to hold off on pushing for an injunction and instead trying to push for housing, the provincial government took advantage of COVID-19 and used its emergency powers to close that camp and also to close 2 other camps in Victoria, which led to the subsequent tent city at Crab Park, and after that was evicted to another tent city, which is now at Strathcona. Something that we've seen during these last months is a rise of a number of Indigenous-led tent cities, both at Crab Park and now at Strathcona. These are spaces which are explicitly Indigenous-led, with elders who are constantly on site, with sacred fires that are burning at all times, and where people are asked to come and engage in protocol when they come to the site. I wanted to quote something from a recent article by Angela Starrett, an Indigenous reporter at CBC, who spoke with Veronica, and an Anishinaabe elder who lived at both the Crab Park tent city and is now at Strathcona tent city. She was asked why everyone has to do protocol when they first come to the tent city. And she said to connect to their own relative spiritually, to connect to this land they're on, and then to each other. Lastly, during protocol, she asked people to pray that everyone there finds a home. As a lawyer working within the context of tent cities on unceded lands, we are in an ongoing dialogue of what it means to defend the rights of largely Indigenous people who are currently homeless and who are also currently on unceded lands, and what it means to support people in pursuing their rights, and also to assert the much larger claims that people are making about the history of colonization. The treatment that people received at both of these sites is deeply reflective of what my colleague Meenakshi was already talking about earlier today, which is that we have a policing system that is deeply racist and rooted in anti-Indigenous ideology. Our police were intimately involved in clearing people from a tent city to nowhere, and they were also involved in forcing an elder off of a tent city where they were safeguarding a ceremonial fire, again, to nowhere. This is not an institution which has any ability to engage with a reconciliation with Indigenous people on these lands. Finally, I wanted to talk briefly about the guest bans that some people have already discussed. We engage in targeted advocacy with a number of nonprofit housing providers and also BC Housing, advocating for a lift of the guest bans. There's been clear statements from local public health authorities at this time saying that, especially in the Dentony side, overdose is the greatest risk, a far greater risk than COVID-19. people should be allowed to have their guests and engage in peer witnessing. Notwithstanding this, many buildings continue to have total guest bans. Again, this feels deeply reflective of the fact that guest bans are not ultimately about public health. They're about ease of management over the rights and needs of people living in these buildings. And given that none of the housing providers or BC Housing has engaged with the letters of advocacy that we've done to date, we're currently talking about whether there's more explicit legal avenues to pursue. And just before going, in terms of what we need from you right now, as other colleagues have alluded to, we are in a moment where there is great pain, but also possibility. We are seeing movement on discussions that have seemed completely unmovable before. One of those discussions is around the policy that government takes around tent cities. The province recently issued guidelines. They're woefully inadequate, but for the first time, they're kind of openly acknowledging that these can be spaces of safety for people. We need people who are part of our work to understand that we support non-displacement, but we do not support carceral camps. We do not want tent cities to become part of a housing continuum. We support the rights of people to protect their own health and safety in the midst of a lack of housing, while ultimately pushing for safe, affordable, and adequate housing as the answer. So thank you all for being here today and for listening to us and hearing about our work.
Thank you so much, Anna. I just want to encourage anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment to please feel free to type your question or comment into the chat box. So that should be, if you're in full screen mode, I'm just kind of looking at it myself here. If you hit control panel, you hit view control panel and view in window mode, you should be able to see the chat box. So please feel free to type your questions.
And I've just brought everyone kind of back into the virtual space here. So if there are any questions, we can allocate them to the appropriate folks.
Kristen, if it's okay, while we're waiting for questions, I wanted to share a couple of organizations that were really helpful to my campaign work during the pandemic. And one of them is the Policing the Pandemic resource that's compiled by two folks in Ontario and Quebec, I believe, Alex Lescombe and Alex McClelland, who early on started to track the role of police in this pandemic. And again, noting that we are actually in dual and intertwined health emergencies. But I really want to credit the work of Policing the Pandemic because they illustrated how quickly public health interventions can be taken up by law enforcement, specifically through things like ticketing, displacement, discriminatory enforcement. I think that we've seen that here in the tent city context and across so-called North America. It's been really evident in terms of who is policed for being in public space. And predictably, that is Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other racialized folks. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Policing the Pandemic.
Thanks for that, Meenakshi. I'm just going to check so we have a few questions. One of them is about safe supply. So this is directed to Caitlin. Just want to make sure you're unmuted. So the city has supported safe supply. The city of Vancouver has supported the safe supply. How is that working out and is it sufficient?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. And I think the progress that we've seen around safe supply has been one of the ways in which we're seeing things become possible that weren't before. Safe supply is something that people who use drugs have been calling for years, and it's never allegedly been possible until now. That being said, there's always serious growing pains with any rollout of any program, and that this rollout is certainly no exception. And unfortunately, it's also been entirely inadequate based on what we've heard from the folks that we work with. So we've heard a lot about an inability to access doctors who will prescribe. So it's one thing to make substances prescribable and to say we support safe supply, but it's another to actually have doctors that are willing to prescribe those substances and to prescribe them in a way that's low barrier and accessible to folks who maybe don't have doctors that they see super often, are dealing with other struggles in terms of housing and income and that sort of thing. So to answer your question in brief, based on what I continue to hear on the daily from folks on the ground, no, it's not inadequate, but it is an opening that I think we need to continue pressing on. And there are a number of groups now who are kind of documenting the struggles that they're facing in terms of accessing the safe supply that is being rolled out as of the COVID emergency declaration. So that's where I think we're all going to need to be looking to see what the gaps are and to follow the lead of people who use drugs. And the last thing I'll say is that I think the event that I mentioned at the end of my piece, which was a sort of de facto safe supply that was entirely created by people who use drugs in a way that worked for them, is the clearest indication we can get that the existing system is not working for people. When people are feeling compelled to put their own liberties on the line, that's when we know that the state is not providing adequately. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And this next question is for Meenakshi, so it's a bit topical at the moment. So when it comes to abolishing the police, this feels like such a difficult thing to achieve. While I believe, or this person asked question believes that it's complete while in it completely, what would some tangible first steps be in that journey about abolishing the police?
Great. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that when we're talking about abolishing the police, and here I want to credit again abolitionist thinkers like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, Angela Davis, many others as well, Robin Maynard, etc. But when we're thinking about abolishing the police, we also need to think about furnishing conditions that would prevent people from being criminalized. So there's been a number of things that people on this webinar have discussed, like decriminalizing sex work, decriminalizing substance use, allowing people to live without fear of displacement. I see all of those things as really tangible steps towards abolition. I think if you are also kind of interested in starting to learn about this, you can look at the work of Critical Resistance, and they've put out a really powerful resource about reform versus abolitionist approaches to policing. So again, you might hear calls in the media for things like body cams, diversity training, more multicultural police force, more gender diverse police force. Let's be really clear, none of those things actually address systemic issues with police. Let's be even clearer, they are a liberal, deliberate liberal step that misleads us from abolition. What we need to do is really invest in communities, invest in networks of care that don't rely on policing. And I know that feels like a massive idea, but it can also be really tangible, right? There's a motion before City Council tonight that's been adjourned for 3 weeks, but that relates to street stops. There's another motion that Jean Swanson has put forth that relates to like more broadly decriminalizing poverty. And that's where I think that like the campaign work that Pivot does really does aim to establish conditions where people would no longer need to be criminalized because their needs would actually be met. So I think that those are some tangible things to begin advocating for. The call to action that Anna made at the end of her comments, the need for safe supply and decrim in tandem, the need for sex workers to basically just earn an income in the absence of safe working conditions right now. So I hope that, you know, gives some initial food for thought.
That's great. Thanks, Meenakshi. I'm just going to ask two more questions. So this one is for Anna. So in your presentation, so this question is about your presentation and how you noted that you don't want to see tent cities as part of the housing continuum, yet some residents seem to want to continue, mainly because of a strong sense of community within the camps. So how should we resolve this apparent contradiction?
Thank you. And yeah, really fair question, because one of the things we hear the most coming out of tent cities for people is that they do provide community. I think what we have to recognize is community as compared to what? What is it about existing housing that is available that makes people feel like they cannot have community in it? And I think this goes back to this bigger issue of this broad narrative that is often pushed by government around tent cities, of claiming basically that people are housing resistant and they don't want to go inside, and that's where you have to police them into housing. That's fundamentally untrue. When people don't want to go into housing, it's because the housing they are being offered is horrifyingly inadequate for many, many reasons. Some of those reasons have to do with being unable to live with partners or unable to keep their pets, unable to use substances. But that also includes housing being fundamentally carceral, highly managed, people not having rights, and people not being able to build community in their living spaces because those spaces are not conducive to building community. And you know, a really good example would be the modular housing that was set up in Maple Ridge. Somebody was actually banned from going to that building for, quote, room hopping, because he was visiting too many friends in that building. So they banned him for some time. I think often where the gap in understanding is coming in is that we don't understand the conditions people are forced to live in order to be indoors right now. And when people say they prefer tent cities, what they're generally saying is they prefer tent cities to being without shelter or to being in shelter and housing, which violates their rights and doesn't safeguard their basic dignity.
Thanks. Thanks, Anna. I'm just going to ask one last question just because we're just wrapping up and it's close to 7. So this is kind of for everyone. So what is something that we can do as supporters to help support this work in the context of COVID-19? Any sort of frontline, any suggestions like frontline organizations to donate to and participate in? So this is kind of for everyone in the room.
I would bring people back to our call out in June, where we asked for folks to donate to local Black-led mutual aid funds, including the Vancouver Black Therapy Foundation, Hogan's Alley Society, and the Black in BC COVID-19 Relief Fund. Those are 3 places that I can think of as a start. And we'll mail you a free Know Your Rights booklet.
I would also add to that, just if obviously there's a lot of actions happening right now, if you see call outs from organizers for folks to show up in numbers, please do so if you can and if you're able to, and if that's a safe option for you, because it's been really heartening to see the number of people at actions and events lately, and we need to keep it up.
I'll just say that one thing that folks can do if they would like to do something perhaps a little more hands-on than making a donation, you can go to the tent city at Strathcona and donate supplies to them, figure out what's needed there. They have organizers who are accepting donations usually on Fridays. And there's lots of work to be done down there by anyone who is willing to do it. So if you're not able to make a financial donation, but maybe you have a little bit of time to spend a few hours helping, that would be a good way to do it right now.
Cool. Is there any kind of last words from anyone else before we wrap up?
I just, Anna here, the disembodied voice. I think the only thing I wanted to add to what everyone's already said is that continuing to have conversations with the people in your life who don't understand, who are racist, who are anti-homeless, who are anti-substance user, the folks who wouldn't come to this webinar or anything like it. That work, while not like public or outward facing, is some of the most important work in actually shifting society on a broader level, and is something that anybody can do, even if they don't have money or they can't leave home. It's really valuable.
Cool. And I just wanted to ask VS and Carrie if there's any kind of last words or other organizations you'd like to platform right now and kind of discuss or mention before we end the webinar.
Sure, I was just going to say sex workers will likely continue to need support. So if you could consider giving to either the PACE Relief Fund or the Swan Relief Fund, and you can find both of those on their websites.
Cool.
I unfortunately don't have anything else to add. I was going to try to mention something about the tent city, and yeah, don't just bring supplies kind of randomly. That's been one thing that a lot of people out there have made a big note of. So try to. I don't have any social media accounts off the top of my head to try to find that information out. But yeah,
No
I think
Gentle.
No Gentle. There you go. Thanks, Anna.
No Gentle on Instagram. They regularly post needs from Strathcona Tent City.
Mm-hmm. I think they tend to have a list up as well, so it's quite comprehensive if you manage to see that. So I highly encourage that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just again, the Instagram is No Gentle, so NOGENTLE to follow online. But yeah, I guess we'll just wrap it up right now. Thanks for everyone for joining, all the attendees and participants kind of watching us right now, and all the speakers, including Naomi and Kirsten, for the ASL interpretation. And as you can see from a webinar, the work that we're doing at Pivot is ongoing, and there's lots of challenges and hurdles along the way. And you can support the work that we're doing on an ongoing basis through monthly donations, which is the most sustainable way to support us. You can make a donation online at pivotlegal.org/donate. And if there's any other questions, you can contact us through email and all the social media as well. So thanks again for joining. Thanks. Bye.